Let's walk through a way of adding binding to our quilts. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are going to be walking through how to add binding to our quilts. So as you can see here, I have a piece of material that has been quilted. So at this stage, it has both that quilt top, a bottom, it has batting on the inside, and we have gone through the steps of stitching it to have some sort of quilted pattern in whichever way you want to do that. Now I have specifically left this kind of messy on purpose, as part of this video is going to be walking through how we clean everything up. First though, we are going to start on our binding. So we need to cut out some binding we'll be able to use for our quilt. So for my binding, I like to use about 1.5 inches wide piece of material. And then you want to cut this out however long around your quilt is. So you would measure each edge of your quilt, and then you would add those 4 edges together, and then probably about like 1 inch or 2 more, so that you could get the entire dimensions of how long you need your piece of binding. Now, especially on larger quilts, you may need to combine multiple pieces together. There are also different ways that you can make this be like one continuous piece, and you can definitely look on YouTube and online for different ways to do that. I will be showing you though in this video how you can connect 2 pieces of binding together to help it have less bulk. So to do this, you can see I have my 2 pieces of binding here I'm going to be using, and I have the right side of my material is going to be facing up for one piece, so I'm going to leave this here. And then my second piece of binding, I'm going to have the right side facing down so that the right sides of this binding are together. I am then going to put this at a 90-degree angle. So as you can see here, my 2 pieces of binding are laid out so that they have their corners touching. It's at that 90-degree angle. And I'm going to take a ruler and just mark from the point from the end of one piece of binding to the edge of that other piece of binding. So almost creating this right triangle effect. And so I have marked this with my pen, and that is where I'm going to be taking a seam, is right along that edge. So on my sewing machine here, you can see where I drew out that line. I am going to backstitch at the beginning and then just take a straight seam all the way down, and then when I get to the end, I will backstitch again. And what this will do is we were then going to be able to trim off that little triangle portion, and when I open up my binding, I'm then going to have these 2 pieces of material connected, and when I fold this over and actually use it on my quilt, it's not going to be as bulky as if you just sewed them together. You definitely can just sew these together though, and there's really no issue. It just kind of comes as a matter of preference if you want to be bulky or not. Now to press this out, you could definitely just finger press it. If you had your iron very handy, you could definitely do that as well. So now it is time to get our quilt ready for the binding, and to do that we are going to trim up the edges. So as you've gone quilting with it, you know you may have some extra batting that's on the side that needs to be cut off. So what I do is I just take a ruler and my rotary cutter, and I just cut off each of these to get a nice straight line. You could definitely use scissors as well for this. But now it is time to attach our binding. So with the right side of your binding facing down, with the right side of the quilt facing up, so the right sides are together, you're going to take a pin or a quilting clip and pin your binding to the quilt. You want to leave about 1 inch or so flap though on the one side of the pin, as we are not going to be sewing that, and you'll see later how we use that to join these 2 pieces of binding together. So now at the corner of our quilt, we need to do something a little different so that we can make sure that the binding lays right. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my finger on one side, and then I'm going to push the binding so that it becomes flat and flush with the other side of the quilt to sort of form this triangle flap. And I'm going to take a pin and diagonally pin it onto one side of that flap, and then I'll take another pin to add to the other side of that flap. And then I'm just going to continue this process all the way around the quilt, being careful at those corners to make sure that I am folding it so that it has that flap on either side. Now for the edge, for where we want to join them together, I am just going to bring the binding all the way to that edge, leaving that flap of material on either side. Now when it comes to sewing this on, I'm going to machine stitch it on using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The smaller seam allowance you use, the less binding you're going to see. The bigger the seam allowance, the more binding you're going to see. And then I'm just going to start sewing. Now when I get to my edge of the corner, I am now going to stop though and carefully sew all the way down to wherever that flap is. So essentially I'm going to be sewing down to where my pin is. And then when I get to my pin, I'm going to stop and I'm going to backstitch. The big thing for this is we do not want to sew over that flap. Sewing over that flap will kind of make it look messy on the front. So I like to sew all the way as close to the flap as I can get it. Then I'm going to take this off my sewing machine and I'm going to start again on the other edge. So moving this flap of material over so that I am not sewing it, but I am just starting as close to it as I possibly can, and then I will begin sewing doing the exact same steps I did before. And I will repeat this for each side, starting and stopping right as I get to that corner to make sure that I'm not actually sewing over the corner. Now when I get to my fourth edge where I started and where I'm going to be stopping, I'm going to sew as close as I can to where I started. So you can see I have these two pieces of material, and now I'm just going to sew them together using a straight stitch. And I fold my quilt over one way, and then I have those two pieces of binding that I'm now stitching together, just doing a nice straight stitch, being sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end, and then I can trim off both of those edges of that extra material. And when I do this, I'm then going to be able to unfold my quilt, and you can see that now we have our binding on the front of our quilt. It looks really nice. All the corners lay very nicely. Nothing looks too messy or like it's not laying well. Everything looks good. So now what it comes time to do is hand stitch the back. So for this binding, this is a method where you do one side is machine stitching and then another side is hand stitching. I know that hand stitching can take some time though, so there's definitely a lot of different ways to do this. So the way that I finish off my binding is I take my fabric and I fold it over once, and then I fold it over again. So I'm folding it in half, and then I'm folding that fabric over the rest of my quilt so I can finish off that one edge. So I'll show it again. So I fold it once. So you can see here I have it folded over, and then I'm just going to fold it again, and then I'm going to pin that down. And then I'm just going to continue this folding process for each of those long edges. Now the best part about the way that we did the front of our quilt with the binding is that when you get to the corners, they should mostly just lay on their own. So what you can do is after you do that one edge, you can then try a second edge of folding, the binding in on itself and then folding it over. And then when it comes down to the actual corner material, what you'll see is that the corner is actually sort of laying so that it has now folded where it goes over one side so that it is not bulky, it doesn't look too messy. So you can see here that I just need to readjust my fabric slightly, and then when I put the one edge in, I can then just pin the second corner, and the corner actually works really well. And I just do this all the way around my quilt for the rest of the binding. I find that this gives it a really nice and clean finish. You don't see any extra seams on the front, especially if you are hand sewing it this way, as you're able to just do that kind of invisible stitch on the back, and it gives everything a really nice and professional look. Now for hand sewing, I take my needle and thread, and then I do add a knot into the thread at the end of it, and then I just begin sewing along my way. Now this can be a little tricky with the pins as the thread kind of gets stuck on the pins at times, but what I do is I go through the back of the quilt, and then I go underneath into the binding, as you can see here, and then I pull that through. And as you can see, you may get stuck on a pin here or there that you just need to adjust for. But then once you do that, you can just continue on this way of sewing all the way around, doing a nice invisible stitch or even like a whip stitch depending on how much you want it to be seen. And while this can take some time, I do think that it gives it a really nice and clean look. Now if at any point you need to add more thread on, you can easily do that by just tying a knot into your thread that what you were using on the quilt, and then just starting over with a brand new piece. And that's what I've done multiple times for quilts. The nice part about the binding is it does sort of hide it for you so you won't be able to see. So this is what the finished quilt product looks like. You can see that you have that quilted material on the front and back, and then that binding just makes it so that the edges are nice and clean and neat for you. You'll be able to reuse this, you can wash it, you don't have to worry about anything happening. If you enjoyed this tutorial and you want to see more, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see next. Thanks for watching.